April 30th, 1945. 3:30 p.m. The Führer bunker, 8.5 meters beneath the shattered Reich Chancellery garden. Rokas Misch, SS telephonist and one of Hitler's bodyguards, stood frozen outside the Führer's private study, hands trembling as he heard the single gunshot that would echo through history. He had served Adolf Hitler for 9 years, from the heights of conquest to this subterranean tomb. What he witnessed in the following minutes contradicted every oath of loyalty, every promise of final victory, every assurance that the Führer would never abandon Germany. The man who had commanded armies across 3 continents, who had held 80 million Germans in his grip, who had promised a 1,000-year Reich, had chosen self-destruction over facing the consequences of his actions. In the room beyond the heavy steel door lay the bodies of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, ending a regime that had plunged the world into war and murdered millions. The mathematics of this collapse were being written not in grand strategic failure, but in the psychological disintegration of a man who could not accept reality, surrounded by subordinates too terrified or deluded to tell him the truth. The bunker that was supposed to be a temporary command post had become a tomb where delusion met reality in the most final way possible. The transformation from world conqueror to underground fugitive had begun long before the bunker became Hitler's permanent residence. January 16, 1945. The Reich Chancellery, Berlin. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff, confronted Hitler with intelligence reports showing Soviet forces massing for an offensive across the Vistula River with overwhelming numerical superiority. The exchange, recorded in Guderian's post-war memoir, revealed the growing disconnect between Hitler and reality. Guderian presented maps showing 225 Soviet divisions, 12,000 tanks, and 13,400 aircraft preparing to attack German positions held by 75 divisions, many under strength and lacking heavy weapons. Hitler's response sent shockwaves through the assembled staff officers. "This is the greatest bluff since Genghis Khan. Who produced this rubbish? The man responsible should be committed to a lunatic asylum." Guderian, one of Germany's most respected armored commanders, stood his ground. "Mein Führer, the intelligence is verified by multiple sources. General Galen's Foreign Armies Department has confirmed these numbers through reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, and signal intercepts. The offensive will begin within 2 weeks." Hitler's face flushed red. His hands, which had developed a noticeable tremor, shook with rage. "I refuse to accept this defeatist intelligence. Galen is a defeatist. You are a defeatist. The German soldier will hold because I order him to hold." The meeting ended with Hitler dismissing the intelligence and refusing to authorize defensive preparations. 3 days later, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive began exactly as predicted, shattering German lines and advancing 300 kilometers in 23 days. The delusion that would characterize Hitler's final months had crystallized into absolute denial. The Führer bunker itself represented both engineering achievement and strategic absurdity. Construction had begun in 1943 when the Allied bombing campaign made above-ground command posts untenable. The facility consisted of 2 levels, the upper Vorbunker completed in 1943 and the lower Führer bunker finished in January 1945. The lower bunker lay 8.5 meters below ground, protected by a 4-meter-thick reinforced concrete roof designed to withstand direct hits from the heaviest Allied bombs. The complex contained 18 small rooms built around a central corridor. Hitler's personal quarters consisted of a small bedroom, study, and conference room totaling less than 100 square meters. The quarters that had been planned as a temporary shelter during air raids became his permanent residence from January 16, 1945, until his death on April 30th. Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's personal secretaries, described the oppressive atmosphere in her memoir published in 2002. The bunker smelled of diesel fuel, mildew, and unwashed bodies. The ventilation system hummed constantly, but never quite eliminated the stench. The concrete walls wept with condensation. There were no windows, no natural light, no connection to the world above except through radio reports that grew more desperate daily. Time lost meaning. We slept when exhausted and worked when summoned. The only clock that mattered was Hitler's chaotic schedule, often sleeping until mid-afternoon, then holding meetings until dawn. The psychological environment proved even more toxic than the physical conditions. The bunker population fluctuated between 300 and 500 people, cramped into spaces designed for 150. They included Hitler's inner circle, military staff officers, SS guards, secretaries, servants, and an ever-changing parade of generals summoned to receive orders for armies that no longer existed. The hierarchy remained rigid, even as the Reich collapsed. Nikolaus von Belows, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, described the surreal formality maintained underground. Protocol was observed as if we still ruled Europe. Visitors removed caps and clicked heels before entering Hitler's presence. Salutes were exchanged, military courtesies maintained. Meanwhile, we could hear Soviet artillery getting closer daily. The explosions shook dust from the concrete ceiling. But inside the conference room, Hitler moved phantom divisions on maps, planned counter-offensives with non-existent armies, and issued orders to units that had been destroyed weeks earlier. No one dared tell him the truth directly. The military conferences that dominated bunker life descended into exercises in collective delusion. Twice daily, at irregular hours depending on Hitler's sleep schedule, senior commanders gathered in the conference room to brief the Führer on the military situation. By April 1945, these briefings had become theatrical performances where reality was carefully edited to avoid triggering Hitler's rage. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, attended his first bunker conference on April 23rd and later described the experience to Allied interrogators. I reported the actual situation. Soviet forces had penetrated the city from 3 directions. Civilian evacuation had failed. Ammunition stocks would last perhaps 72 hours. Breakout was still possible, but the window was closing. Hitler listened while I spoke, then turned to his maps. He began planning a relief offensive using SS General Felix Steiner's army group. I knew Steiner commanded perhaps 15,000 men, mostly Luftwaffe ground crew and Hitler Youth with minimal heavy weapons. Hitler spoke of them as if they were a fully equipped army of 100,000. He traced grand envelopment maneuvers on the map. No one corrected him. I realized then that I had entered an insane asylum where the patients were running the institution. The Steiner offensive became the defining delusion of Hitler's final days. On April 21st, Hitler ordered SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner to attack southward into the Soviet flank north of Berlin with his army group. The attack would supposedly cut off Soviet spearheads, relieve Berlin, and turn the tide of battle. Steiner received the order while commanding a collection of SS remnants, Luftwaffe personnel, and teenage Hitler Youth, totaling fewer than 10,000 effectives with limited ammunition and no armor support. Steiner faced an impossible choice. Obeying the order meant sacrificing his men in a suicidal attack that could not possibly succeed. Refusing meant execution for treason. He chose a third option, passive disobedience. He moved his forces into defensive positions and waited, neither attacking as ordered nor formally refusing the command. For 24 hours, Hitler waited for news of Steiner's offensive that would save Berlin. The attack never came. April 22nd, 1945. The afternoon briefing began normally with staff officers presenting optimistic reports, carefully scrubbed of devastating details. Then someone mentioned that Steiner had not yet attacked. Hitler asked for confirmation of Steiner's progress. Silence. He asked again, voice rising. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief adjutant, finally admitted that Steiner had not attacked and showed no signs of preparing to attack. What followed became known among survivors as The breakdown. Hitler's rage exploded with volcanic intensity. He screamed that he had been betrayed by everyone, the generals, the SS, the party, the German people themselves. He declared the war lost and announced he would remain in Berlin and die. For 2 hours, the tirade continued as staff officers stood frozen, afraid to speak or move. Traudl Junge, summoned to take dictation, witnessed the collapse. Hitler paced like a caged animal. His face was grey. His hands shook uncontrollably. He screamed that cowards and traitors had surrounded him from the beginning. The generals had sabotaged every operation. The SS had betrayed their oaths. The German people had proven unworthy of their Führer. Then suddenly he collapsed into a chair and began weeping. This man who had terrorized Europe sat sobbing while we watched in horror and pity and relief that his rage had finally burned out. He looked up with tears streaming and said, "The war is lost. I shall remain in Berlin and shoot myself when the time comes." The admission that the war was lost did not, paradoxically, lead to rational action. Hitler refused suggestions that he flee to Bavaria, where German forces still held territory. He refused to authorize the breakout of Berlin's garrison while evacuation remained possible. He refused to negotiate surrender to spare Berlin's remaining civilians from the final battle. Instead, he retreated deeper into fantasy, planning phantom offenses with armies that existed only on maps while reality closed in. The bunker population divided into factions as Hitler's grip on reality disintegrated. One group, including propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and SS chief Heinrich Himmler, recognized the end was near but maneuvered for position in whatever came after. Another group, including Hitler's secretaries and personal staff, existed in a state of numb denial, performing their duties while avoiding thoughts of the future. A third group, including various generals, began positioning for survival, establishing contact with the Western Allies or planning escapes. The most dramatic betrayal came from Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust and commander of the SS. On April 23rd, Hitler learned through a Reuters news report that Himmler had attempted to negotiate Germany's surrender to the Western Allies through Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte. The news struck Hitler like a physical blow. Himmler, der treue Heinrich, faithful Heinrich, the man who had commanded the extermination apparatus, had committed what Hitler considered the ultimate treason. Rochus Misch witnessed Hitler's reaction when he received the news. Hitler went pale, then red, then pale again. His entire body shook. He whispered, "Himmler. Himmler has betrayed me?" Then he began screaming for Himmler's arrest. But Himmler was not in the bunker. He had fled north. So Hitler ordered the arrest of Himmler's liaison officer, SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, who was also married to Eva Braun's sister. They dragged Fegelein from where he was hiding in civilian clothes, drunk and preparing to desert. Hitler personally ordered his execution in the Chancellery Garden. The man was shot like a dog while Hitler listened from the bunker. The Fegelein execution demonstrated that Hitler retained power over life and death in his immediate vicinity, even as his authority over Germany dissolved. Within the bunker's concrete walls, Hitler's word remained absolute law. Outside, Germany was disintegrating. Regional commanders surrendered their forces without reference to Berlin. Army Group B had surrendered 325,000 men to American forces on April 18th. Hamburg was negotiating surrender. Munich had fallen. Vienna had fallen. Yet in the bunker conference room, officers moved flags representing divisions that no longer existed and planned operations with armies that had ceased to function as organized formations. The surreal contrast between bunker life and the battle raging above created a psychological split among the inhabitants. During the day, they performed their duties, answering phones, typing orders, preparing briefing documents, as if the Third Reich still functioned. At night, they gathered in the bunker's cramped quarters to drink, gossip, and occasionally confront reality. Gerda Christian, another of Hitler's secretaries, described the nighttime gatherings in the bunker's small dining area. We would sit drinking cognac or champagne from the chancellery cellars while Soviet shells exploded overhead. The lights would flicker with each nearby impact. Dust would drift from the ceiling. Someone would put a record on the gramophone to mask the sound of the bombardment. We talked about anything except our situation. Movies we had seen, books we had read. Peacetime memories. It was a form of collective madness. We knew we were doomed, but could not bring ourselves to acknowledge it directly. The children in the bunker added another layer of tragic absurdity. Magda Goebbels, wife of the propaganda minister, had brought their 6 children to the bunker in mid-April. The children, aged 4 to 12, played in the corridors while the Reich collapsed around them. They were unaware that their parents had decided to kill them rather than allow them to live in a world without National Socialism. Rokas Misch encountered the children playing soldiers in the corridor on April 28th. The Goebbels children were singing songs and playing games as if this was a camping adventure. The oldest girl, Helga, asked me if the explosions outside were thunder. I told her yes, a thunderstorm. She asked when they could go outside again. I said soon. She smiled and went back to playing. I knew her parents planned to poison her within days. The knowledge made me physically ill. But what could I do? Goebbels would have me shot for interfering. So I smiled at the children and walked away, hating myself. As Soviet forces tightened their grip on central Berlin, Hitler's attention fixated on personal matters rather than military realities. On April 28th, he learned that Mussolini had been captured by Italian partisans, executed, and his body displayed hanging upside down in Milan. The news terrified Hitler. He summoned witnesses and dictated his last will and testament, then insisted on marrying Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony performed after midnight on April 29th. The wedding was a bizarre parody of normalcy, conducted while the Reich died. Josef Goebbels and Martin Bormann served as witnesses. A minor city official named Walter Wagner, drafted into the Volkssturm militia, was brought to the bunker to perform the ceremony. Wagner, who had conducted hundreds of weddings in peacetime, later described the underground marriage to British interrogators before his death in Soviet custody. I was brought to the bunker by SS guards who gave no explanation. They led me to a small room where Hitler and Eva Braun stood waiting with perhaps a dozen witnesses. Hitler looked like a man who had aged 20 years. His left hand trembled continuously. His eyes were dull. I conducted the standard civil ceremony, asking the required questions. Both parties confirmed they were of pure Aryan descent and had no hereditary diseases. Eva Braun started to sign her name as Eva Braun, then crossed it out and wrote Eva Hitler. The entire ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Afterward, champagne was served. People congratulated the couple as if this was a normal wedding rather than a prelude to suicide. I was escorted out and told to say nothing. I learned the next day that they were both dead. The wedding completed, Hitler spent his final hours dictating his political testament, a rambling document that blamed the war on international Jewry, praised the German people who he claimed had betrayed him, and named Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. The document revealed that Hitler had learned nothing and regretted nothing. In death, as in life, he accepted no responsibility for the catastrophe he had created. April 30th began with news that Soviet forces were within 300 meters of the bunker. Shells were landing in the Chancellery garden above. Periodic explosions shook the concrete structure. Hitler emerged from his quarters around noon, looking worse than anyone had seen him. His hand tremor had become so pronounced that he held his right hand with his left to control it. He shuffled rather than walked. His eyes, once so hypnotic to observers, appeared glazed and unfocused. He gathered his personal staff and said farewell to each with a handshake or brief word. Traudl Junge, who had typed his final testament through the night, received his final words to her. Hitler took my hand and said, "I want to apologize for not giving you a better wedding present than this." He was referring to a cyanide capsule he had distributed to the bunker staff. Then he said, "I wish I could give you better memories." He released my hand and walked back toward his quarters with Eva at his side. That was the last time I saw him alive. Around 3:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his study. The steel door closed. Witnesses in the corridor included Rochus Misch, Otto Günsche, Hitler's SS adjutant, Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet, and Martin Bormann. They waited in tense silence, smoking and avoiding eye contact. Then they heard a single gunshot. Günsche waited 30 seconds, then slowly opened the door. Hitler sat slumped on a couch, shot through the right temple with his 7.65mm Walter pistol lying at his feet. Eva Braun sat beside him, dead from cyanide poisoning. The smell of bitter almonds from the cyanide and cordite from the gunshot filled the small room. Günsche immediately closed the door and reported to Martin Bormann. "The Führer is dead." The body removal was handled with mechanical efficiency that suggested prior planning. Heinz Linger and members of the SS bodyguard wrapped the bodies in blankets and carried them up the bunker stairs to the Chancellery garden. Soviet shells were landing nearby, forcing the men to crouch and run between explosions. They placed the bodies in a shallow shell crater, doused them with 200 liters of gasoline from jerry cans, stockpiled for this purpose, and set them on fire. Otto Günsche stood watching the bodies burn while shells exploded around him. He later described the scene to Allied interrogators. "The fire burned for over 2 hours. We kept adding gasoline when the flames diminished. Soviet artillery continued landing nearby, but we maintained the fire. Eventually, only charred remains were left. We shoveled these into a canvas and buried them in another shell crater, covering them with earth. The entire time, I kept thinking that this was how the man who promised to rule the world for 1,000 years was leaving it, as a partially cremated corpse buried in a bomb crater during an enemy artillery barrage." The bunker occupants' reactions to Hitler's death ranged from relief to despair to pragmatic concern for survival. Joseph Goebbels, now the highest-ranking Nazi in the bunker, briefly became Reich Chancellor under Hitler's testament before deciding to follow his Führer's example. On May 1st, Goebbels had his 6 children sedated, then poisoned with cyanide capsules crushed in their mouths while they slept. Afterward, he and his wife Magda took cyanide themselves, while SS guards shot them to ensure death. The Goebbels family was buried in the same garden as Hitler. The remaining bunker inhabitants faced choices about how to spend their final hours or attempt survival. General Hans Krebs, Chief of Staff, attempted to negotiate surrender terms with Soviet forces, but was rebuffed with demands for unconditional capitulation. Rather than face Soviet capture, Krebs shot himself on May 1st. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Chief Adjutant, shot himself the same day. Martin Bormann attempted to escape the bunker on May 1st during a breakout attempt and likely died near the Lehrter station, though his fate remained uncertain for decades. The secretaries and junior staff made desperate attempts to escape through Soviet lines. Traudl Junge successfully fled the bunker on May 1st, eventually reaching Western Allied lines after weeks in hiding. Gerda Christian was captured by Soviet forces and spent years in captivity. Rochus Misch was captured on May 2nd when Soviet forces finally stormed the bunker complex. He spent 9 years in Soviet prison camps before release in 1954. The Soviet discovery of Hitler's remains unfolded with confusion and secrecy that would cloud the historical record for decades. On May 2nd, troops of the 3rd Shock Army captured the Reich Chancellery and bunker complex. They found the Goebbels family's charred corpses, but initially missed Hitler's burial site. On May 4th, a Soviet private named Ivan Churakov discovered badly burned human remains in a shell crater near the bunker emergency exit. The remains were secretly transported to a SMERSH, Soviet counterintelligence facility, for examination. Soviet forensic specialists conducted autopsies and determined through dental records that the remains were indeed Hitler and Eva Braun. However, Stalin ordered the findings kept secret. For years, the Soviet government publicly expressed uncertainty about Hitler's death, suggesting he might have escaped to Spain or Argentina. This deliberate misinformation served Stalin's political purposes by maintaining uncertainty and allowing continued propaganda exploitation. The bunker itself was systematically looted by Soviet forces seeking souvenirs and intelligence documents. Furniture, artwork, weapons, personal items, everything portable was removed. The bunker's wine cellar, containing thousands of bottles of vintage champagne and wine, was consumed by celebrating Soviet soldiers. Maps, documents, and military records were shipped to Moscow for analysis. The conference room where Hitler had planned his conquests and final fantasies was stripped to bare concrete. In subsequent years, the bunker became a pilgrimage site for Nazi sympathizers and curious visitors until East German authorities sealed the entrances in the 1950s and eventually demolished the emergency exit structures. The Führer bunker itself remained intact underground until 1988-1989, when partial demolition filled the main rooms with rubble. Today, the site lies beneath a parking lot and apartment complex. A simple information panel marks the approximate location, providing minimal historical context. The psychological analysis of Hitler's final days has occupied historians and psychiatrists for decades. His behavior in the bunker demonstrated classic symptoms of delusional disorder, paranoia, possible Parkinson's disease, and likely amphetamine addiction. Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, had prescribed increasingly massive doses of stimulants, sedatives, and various medications throughout the war years. By 1945, Hitler was receiving multiple daily injections of compounds including methamphetamine, cocaine, barbiturates, and various hormones. The combination of drugs, stress, isolation, and psychological pressure created a mental state where Hitler could no longer distinguish between reality and fantasy. General Helmuth Weidling, after his release from Soviet captivity in 1955, reflected on Hitler's psychological state during the Anbe final days. He was not insane in the clinical sense. He could conduct coherent conversations, he remembered details, he could analyze situations, but he had lost the ability to accept information that contradicted his desired reality. When presented with facts showing the military situation was hopeless, he simply dismissed those facts as defeatist lies. He created an alternative reality where loyal forces would still arrive to save Berlin, where wonder weapons would still turn the tide, where the German people would still rally for final victory. He believed his own propaganda completely. The question of whether Hitler could have escaped Berlin and prolonged his life has been debated extensively. Several escape plans were proposed by subordinates in April 1945. The most viable involved flying Hitler south to Berchtesgaden while escape remained possible, then potentially fleeing to Spain or South America. Hitler rejected all such proposals, stating repeatedly that he would remain in Berlin and die there rather than become a fugitive. This decision reflected Hitler's understanding of his historical position. Flight would mean survival as a hunted criminal, living under assumed identity without power or purpose. Death in Berlin, particularly suicide to avoid capture, allowed Hitler to control his final narrative. He could claim he died defending Germany's capital rather than fleeing like a coward. He could frame his death as martyrdom rather than defeat. Most importantly, suicide prevented capture and the public trial that would have definitively exposed his crimes and demolished the mythology he had built. The discovery of the Holocaust's full extent in the weeks following Germany's surrender added retrospective horror to Hitler's suicide. as Allied forces liberated concentration camps and documented the systematic murder of 6 million Jews along with millions of other victims, the world confronted the true scale of Nazi atrocities. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, provided legal and historical accounting for crimes against humanity. Hitler's death by suicide denied him nothing. He had already chosen to evade justice through self-destruction. The subordinates who survived the bunker provided testimonies that shaped historical understanding of Hitler's final days. Their accounts, delivered in various contexts over decades, gradually assembled a comprehensive picture despite initial contradictions and self-serving distortions. Rochus Misch, who lived until 2013, gave numerous interviews describing bunker life. His accounts, while sometimes factually questionable regarding dates and details, captured the psychological atmosphere of those final weeks. Misch reflected in a 2005 interview on the experience of watching Hitler's collapse. "I served him for 9 years. I saw him at the height of his power in the late 1930s when he seemed invincible. I saw the gradual change during the war as victories turned to defeats, but nothing prepared me for what he became in the bunker. The trembling hands, the shuffling walk, the blank stare. He looked like a man who had died weeks earlier, but his body didn't know it yet. When I heard the gunshot on April 30th, my first emotion was relief. Relief that it was finally over. Relief that I might survive. Relief that this nightmare had ended. Only later did I feel the full weight of what we had witnessed and participated in." The final assessment of Hitler's bunker period must acknowledge the contrast between the banality of his personal end and the cosmic horror of his historical legacy. In the bunker, Hitler became a pathetic figure, a trembling, delusional old man hiding underground while the world he had tried to conquer destroyed him. But this pathetic end does not diminish the magnitude of the catastrophe he created. World War II killed approximately 85 million people. The Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews in industrialized genocide. Tens of millions more died from war-related famine, disease, and displacement. General Helmuth Weidling, in his final statement before execution by Soviet authorities in 1955, provided perhaps the most concise epitaph for Hitler's bunker days. "I entered that bunker commanding Berlin's defense and discovered I was defending a madman's delusions rather than Germany's capital." Hitler in April 1945 was no longer the leader who had conquered Europe. He was a broken man living in fantasy, giving orders to phantom armies, planning operations that could never occur. So his suicide changed nothing except to confirm what we already knew, that the Reich had died before its Führer pulled the trigger. We were serving a corpse those final weeks. We just didn't admit it until the body was literally burning in the garden above us. The Führer bunker's story ultimately demonstrates how absolute power divorced from accountability creates monsters who cannot confront the consequences of their actions. Hitler had structured Nazi Germany so that no one could tell him unwelcome truths without risking death. This created a feedback loop where reality was progressively distorted until Hitler existed in a fantasy world of loyal armies and imminent victory, while the actual Germany burned around him. His subordinates, compromised by their own crimes and terrified of his rage, enabled the delusion until the very end. The final irony was that Hitler, who had sent millions to their deaths in pursuit of racial domination and imperial conquest, could not face the personal consequences of his own defeat. The man who had ordered the extermination of entire peoples chose to kill himself and his new wife, rather than accept responsibility for his actions. The underground bunker that was supposed to be a temporary command post became his tomb, and the wedding suite that should have been the start of a new life became a suicide chamber. From January 16th, when Hitler descended into the bunker permanently, to April 30th, when the gunshot echoed through the concrete corridors, 105 days passed. In that time, Germany suffered its final catastrophic defeats, lost millions more dead and wounded, and saw its cities reduced to rubble. All while the man who claimed to embody German destiny hid underground, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, planning offensives that could never occur, and constructing elaborate delusions to avoid confronting the truth that he had destroyed the nation he claimed to love. The bunker inhabitants who survived carried psychological scars that lasted their entire lives. Traudl Junge spent decades wrestling with guilt over her service to Hitler, eventually writing and speaking about her experiences as a warning to future generations. Rokas Misch struggled with alcoholism and survivor's guilt. Those who were captured by Soviet forces endured years of brutal captivity, interrogation, and imprisonment before release. The physical bunker was buried, demolished, and paved over as if erasing the structure could erase the history. But the historical record survived through documents, testimonies, and evidence that reconstructed those final days in comprehensive detail. The bunker's story became a crucial chapter in understanding how dictatorships end. Not with glory, but with delusion, not with heroic last stands, but with suicide and betrayal, not with dignity, but with pathetic fantasies maintained until the final moment. Hitler's final days proved that power built on lies, sustained by terror, and directed toward evil ends inevitably collapses into chaos when confronted by reality. The underground tomb where he spent his final weeks represented the ultimate isolation of a man who had isolated himself from truth, from morality, from humanity itself. The single gunshot on April 30th, 1945, ended a life that had caused immeasurable suffering, but it could not undo the damage, could not restore the dead, could not rebuild the destroyed. The Führerbunker stands as historical testimony to the destination of absolute power, unbound by law or conscience. It demonstrates that leaders who surround themselves with yes-men, who punish bearers of bad news, who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, who believe their own propaganda, inevitably lose connection with reality and lead their nations to catastrophe. The bunker was Hitler's final refuge from a world that had rejected him. But there was no refuge from the consequences of his actions. The flames that consumed his body in the Chancellery Garden were a fitting end for a man who had set the world on fire and then retreated underground to avoid the conflagration he had created. The story of Hitler's final days is ultimately a story of chickens coming home to roost, of reality asserting itself over delusion, of justice being served through suicide rather than trial. It proves that tyrants cannot escape accountability forever, that evil creates its own destruction, and that underground bunkers provide no shelter from historical judgment. The concrete tomb beneath Berlin became Hitler's final monument. Not the 1,000-year Reich he promised, but a burial chamber where his grandiose visions died along with him, leaving only ashes, rubble, and the bitter lessons of history.